Richard Boyd Barrett, who is a TDD, who is a TD for People Before Profit here in Ireland in the Dáil, and a founding member of the Irish anti-war movement. And we have Diana, who is a People Before Profit member as well. So without further ado, Ashley, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget, for that introduction. And thanks to all the other speakers, and thanks to People Before Profit for inviting me to speak. We are in a really terrifying situation where Europe seems almost on the brink of war. Russia has assembled about 190,000 troops to the border of Ukraine. The US and NATO have mobilized thousands of troops in addition to their already existing hundreds of thousands of troops on bases throughout Europe, and sent war materiel and munitions and advisors to Ukraine. And this is really the closest time since the Cuban Missile Crisis where two nuclear armed powers are at the point of war. It may not produce war. A lot of this, I think, is military brinkmanship for diplomatic gain at the negotiating table. But it's hard to see what the diplomatic solution is, because the main demand from Russia against NATO expansion and the main demand from the US, which is to continue its expansion, are incompatible. So it could be a protracted conflict. And the most dangerous thing about this situation is the law of unintended consequences is at work, where accidents, provocations, issues could trigger something that actually none of the belligerent parties want. So in this situation, I think it's absolutely vital that the international left take a clear anti-war position. And I'll be just speaking about it from the vantage point of the US left. We have to oppose here in the United States Washington's militarism. That is the main enemy for the people of the world and the people inside the US. At the same time, we have to oppose Russian aggression against Ukraine and defend the right of Ukraine to self-determination, and include the rights, the protection of the rights of Ukraine's national minorities, its Jewish population, its Russian speakers, etc. And I think we have to be clear about what the root of this crisis actually is. In the US and probably globally, we're subject to a barrage of almost daily panicky stories that Russia is the main aggressor. While obviously Russia is an aggressor, the main precipitant of this crisis is Washington's decision to endlessly expand NATO into the Eastern Bloc and into former Soviet republics. So the main precipitator of this crisis is that process of NATO expansion. And the aims of that NATO expansion is really to enforce Washington's geopolitical, economic, and military domination of Europe. And all its pretensions to humanitarian initiatives or democratic aims should be utterly discredited by their track record in Afghanistan and Iraq. So nobody should believe Washington's war propaganda. We have to be clear at the same time that Russia's aims are no less predatory. It is a nuclear armed petropower with imperial ambitions of its own. It wants to reassert its control over its former sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And it has blood on its hand as a result of its counter-revolutionary policies and imperial interventions from Chechnya to Syria and most recently Kazakhstan. So the international left has to both oppose US imperialism and Russian militarism in this situation. And in this conflict, we have to be clear that the European Union is no pacifist force. We have to remember that its member states have ugly imperialist and colonialist histories of their own. Many of them have been complicit in Washington's imperial adventures throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, most horrifically and most recently in Afghanistan. And remember, EU members and EU membership was the trigger for the original conflict between Russia and the United States over Ukraine. It was not actually NATO membership. It was the decision of Ukraine to edge towards membership of the European Union. And just remember, the European Union itself is a neoliberal reactionary institution, a vehicle for the main dominant states, France and Germany, inside the European Union to exert their own own imperial ambitions within the region and internationally. So the US and EU powers have collaborated in NATO from its inception as part of Western imperialism's project of domination of not only Europe, but globally. NATO is an entirely reactionary institution. It is not a defensive institution. The US forged it to project its imperial control over Europe, against Russia, and over European states and economies themselves. And no one less than the first Secretary General of NATO made that abundantly clear. Lord Ismay stated the imperial project of NATO very clearly. He said that it was designed to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. That summarizes the ambitions from the inception all the way to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. Its pretensions to democracy were always a smokescreen. It supported military regimes and coups in Turkey, Portugal, and Greece, and it backed campaigns by the hard right against left-wing movements throughout Europe. And after the Cold War ended, after 1989, the US retooled NATO as its global police force. It first began its exertion by gobbling up states in Eastern Europe, so that now there are 30 member states of NATO, way more than the original 12 that founded it back in 1949. And as I said, it includes many former Soviet republics. And it started not only to gobble up states, but also to impose Washington's will on Eastern Europe in pacification operations as part of NATO enlargement in former Yugoslavia. It was part of the war on Serbia, and it was deployed most recently in Afghanistan to enforce Washington's colonial rule over the country of Afghanistan, which, as we all know, created an absolute humanitarian catastrophe that is ongoing right now in Afghanistan. Now the US is trying to use NATO as its imperial tool against Russia's attempt to push back and reclaim its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. But not only is the US-Russia conflict at stake in this antagonism, but also, and more importantly, the conflict between the US and China, which is right now Russia's imperial sponsor. So this conflict is not only just between the US and Russia, but engulfs the big powers of the world system that are at loggerheads right now, the US and China. So NATO is an imperialist tool of Washington and should be really disbanded. The billions of dollars that go into the military regimes, the military budgets should be repurposed for human need, not militarism for the sake of profit and empire. Now, in opposing both the US and Russia, we should not be indifferent or ignore the Ukraine's rights and Ukraine's people. They're subject to oppression at the hands of Russia, and they're also subject to oppression at the hands of the European Union. They should have the right to self-determination, and we should support progressive movements within Ukraine, unions, feminist organizations, popular struggles in their fight for justice and equality. Now, we know that neither Russia nor the United States will advance those aims of justice and equality. And in fact, their track record proves that they're out for the exact opposite, inequality and injustice. So now is the time to build international opposition to war in Ukraine. People are actually have a gut instinct against the war inside the United States, and I think globally, because it is so terrifying and because the consequences for people's lives will be so devastating, from the United States to Russia to Ukraine to all of Europe. And after 2 decades of endless war, there's deep well springs of anti-war sentiment throughout the world system. And that's on top of the deep grievances that working class people and oppressed people share globally globally against capitalist crisis, against the inequalities that the system on 4 decades of neoliberalism have imposed on people, against the pandemic and the absolute ignoring of the human consequences and cost of the pandemic on people's lives throughout the world, and the deep anger at the oppression, the racism, sexism, homophobia, immigrant bashing that is characteristic of all states in the world. So there's deep well springs of opposition to the status quo and opposition to militarism. And so there's a basis for building a popular anti-war movement that opposes the war and says that we should spend that money that's wasted on militarism for jobs, education, healthcare, and social programs, not for war and occupation. What's missing in this circumstance, and what is our most urgent task, is building an international left to lead this sentiment and transform it into a social force. And so that's incredibly urgent, even if this does not produce a war, because as I said, there's growing and much bigger conflicts between the US and China that are on the horizon. So there's an urgency of building opposition to this war to prepare, even if it doesn't produce an immediate war, for much bigger conflicts to come. So we should be against the war, oppose both the US and NATO and Russia, defend Ukraine's right to self-determination, and do all we can to protect the country's oppressed populations and help them secure their rights. And the most important task is building international solidarity from below against war and empire. There's incredible opportunities to do that. There's an urgency responsibility to do that. And what the left needs to do is rise to the occasion.
Thank you for that, Ashley. Our next speaker is Dennis. Is he in the Zoom call? Our next speaker is Dennis. He is from the Russian Socialist Tendency, and he'll be translated by Rosalie Tinch.
Okay. Yeah. Dennis is here. Денис, ты нас слышишь? Денис? I think he might have some troubles with his microphone. Okay.
We can come back. We can come back. We could change the order if that helps anybody.
Денис, можешь что-нибудь сказать?
Да. Вот сейчас слышно меня?
Oh, okay. Yeah, now we are ready.
Perfect. Take it away.
Денис?
Так, все, я могу начинать свой доклад?
Yeah, you can start.
Все, могу. Хотелось бы начать с краткого экскурса в историческое положение Украины в восточноевропейском регионе.
I would like to begin with a brief excursus into the historical position of Ukraine in the Eastern European region.
Изначально Киев, нынешняя столица Украины, был одним из главных и крупнейших городов ранней Руси.
Initially, Kiev, the current capital of Ukraine, was one of the main and largest cities of the early Rus.
Наравне с Великим Новгородом, а позднее стал столицей Киевской Руси, сохраняя свой формальный статус, также и в период феодальной разрозненности государства.
So Kiev was on equal footing with Великий Novgorod at first, and later it became the capital of Kievan Rus, and it retained its formal status of the capital also during the feudal fragmentation of the state.
При татаро-монгольском нашествии на Русь Киевское княжество пришло в упадок, его политические институты деградировали, а экономика была порушена.
Under the Tatar-Mongol invasion of Russia, the Principality of Kiev fell into decline, and its political institutions degraded, and its economy was ruined.
В дальнейшем, примерно в середине XIV века, это привело к завоеванию большей части территории современной Украины союзом Польши и Литвы.
Around the middle of the 14th century, this led to the conquest of the most of the territory of the present-day Ukraine by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Речь Посполита. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly.
Союз Польши и Литвы также вел множество войн с Россией, которая со временем включила большую часть современной Украины в свой состав.
Речь Посполита waged a lot of wars with Russia, and with time it included most of the modern Ukraine into its composition.
В XVIII веке свой контроль практически над всеми украинскими землями устанавливает Россия, а западные территории, незначительную их часть, Галичина, переходит под контроль Австрии.
In the 18th century, Russia established its control over almost all of Ukrainian territory, but some Western territories, namely Galicia, fell into the control of Austria.
Таким образом, исторически, начиная со средних веков, территория современной Украины практически непрерывно была различными империями, была занята различными империями.
So historically, since the Middle Ages, the territory of modern Ukraine was almost always occupied by different empires.
С запада на эти земли претендовал союз Польши и Литвы, позднее Австрийская империя Габсбургов, а с востока Россия.
Ukrainian lands were claimed by the union of Poland and Lithuania from the west, and later by the Austrian Empire of the Habsburgs. And from the east, the territories were claimed by Russia.
О своей независимости от России Украина впервые заявляет после падения царизма и создания Центральной Рады 22 января 1918 года.
The first time when Ukraine declared its independence from Russia was after the fall of Tsarism and the creation of the Central Rada on January the 22nd of 1918.
Однако трудящиеся Украины в составе с трудящимися уже советской России одержали верх над марионеточными правительствами Украинской Народной Республики. Таким образом, Украина вошла в состав первого пролетарского государства на правах союзной республики.
The workers of Ukraine, in alliance with the workers of, by this time, already the Soviet Russia, defeated the puppet governments of the Ukrainian People's Republic, and thus Ukraine became part of the first proletarian states on the rights of the Union Republic.
До 1991 года Украина находилась в составе СССР, после распада которого она вновь обрела самостоятельность.
So until 1991, Ukraine was part of the USSR. And after the collapse of USSR, it regained its independence.
С этого времени начинается противостояние коллективного Запада и России за империалистический контроль над Украиной.
From that very moment, the confrontation between the West and Russia for the imperialist control of Ukraine, started.
На протяжении последних 3 десятилетий правительства Украины менялись с прозападных на пророссийские, пока, наконец, в 2014 году не произошел Майдан.
Over the past 3 decades, Ukraine's governments changed from pro-Western to pro-Russian, and until finally in 2014, there was the Maidan.
Который изначально был стихийным выступлением, но в результате которого окончательно укрепилось прозападное правительство, и Запад стал доминировать здесь экономически и политически.
Maidan was originally a spontaneous protest, but it finally strengthened the pro-Western government and resulted in Western economic and political dominance in Ukraine.
Россия, в свою очередь, не приняв столь... Так, секунду. Так, Россия, в свою очередь, не приняв столь весомого поражения в своем так называемом ближнем зарубежье, решается на военные действия.
Russia didn't expect such a significant defeat in its so-called near abroad, like neighboring country, decided to take military action.
В 2014 году Россия оккупирует Крым, а также, используя подконтрольные себе силы, дестабилизирует обстановку на востоке Украины.
In 2014, Russia occupies Crimea and by use of forces under its control destabilizes eastern Ukraine.
Что приводит к возникновению марионеточных республик, Луганской и Донецкой народных республик.
And that consequently led to the emergence of the proxy republics of Lugansk and Donetsk.
Возвращаясь к положению сегодняшнего дня, необходимо указать на возможную мотивацию двух соперничающих империализмов – НАТО и Российской Федерации.
So in today's situation, it is necessary to point out the possible motivation of the two rival imperialisms, NATO and the Russian Federation.
Россия стремится не допустить расширения НАТО на восток и приближения его к своим границам.
Russia seeks to prevent NATO from expanding eastward and bringing it closer to its borders.
Это военно-политическая составляющая.
This is the military political component.
Экономическая составляющая заключается в том, что российскому правящему классу необходимо вернуть господство своего капитала в Украине, увеличить экспорт капитала в Украину.
The economic component is that the Russian ruling class needs to regain the dominance of its capital in Ukraine and increase the export of capital to Ukraine.
Также существует внутриполитический аспект, который означает, что правящей партии необходимо вернуть упавшую лояльность общества. По примеру, с Крымским консенсусом, когда оккупация Крыма подняла рейтинги действующей власти.
So there is also the internal political motivation that maybe that the ruling party in Russia needs to regain the decreased loyalty, partly lost loyalty of society, following the example of the Crimean consensus, where the occupation of Crimea raised the ratings of the current government.
Но это вряд ли удастся, если Россия вяжется в продолжительную полномасштабную войну.
But this is an unlikely scenario because, it is not going to succeed, because if Russia gets into a prolonged full-scale war,
народ России устал от экономического кризиса, от роста цен на продукты питания, топливо, услуги коммунального хозяйства, падения реальной заработной платы.
That is due to the fact that people of Russia are tired of the economic crisis, of rising prices for food, fuel, and utilities, and the decreasing of real wages.
Мотивацией коллективного западного империализма может служить попытка показать своему главному сопернику на международной арене, Китаю, что НАТО не будет идти ни на какие уступки после своего поражения в Афганистане.
The collective Western imperialism may be motivated by this conflict by the attempt to show its main rival, national arena, China, that NATO will not make any concessions after its defeat in
В
Afghanistan.
частности, они не готовы идти на уступки по вопросу Республики Китай или Тайваня, которую Китайская Народная Республика намеревается, возможно, включить в свой состав.
Namely, the collective Western forces are showing that they will not make any concessions on the issue of the Republic of China or Taiwan, which China probably intends to incorporate.
Сохранение господства своего капитала в Украине также может служить мотивацией для западного империализма.
Another motivation for the Western imperialism may be maintaining the domination of its capital in Ukraine.
Подводя итог, хочется сказать, что угроза войны вполне вероятна.
To sum it up, I would like to say that the threat of war is quite probable.
Ни Россия, ни НАТО не идут ни на какие уступки друг другу.
Neither Russia nor NATO are making any concessions to each other.
Россия все больше и больше наращивает группировку войск на границе с Украиной, проводит там боевые учения, а подконтрольной России, так называемой республики, объявили всеобщую мобилизацию и начали эвакуацию гражданского населения в регионы России.
Russia is increasing the presence of troops on the border with Ukraine and conducts military exercises there, and the so-called republics under Russian control have announced general mobilization and also started evacuation of civilians to Russian regions.
И буквально в последний час или два президент России Владимир Путин провел пресс-конференцию.
In the last 2 hours or so, Putin has spoken during a conference,
на протяжении которой следовали от Путина антикоммунистические лозунги и заявления.
During the whole length of the during the whole length of this speech, Putin has been saying some anti-communist points. Well,
Путин также заявил, что Украину создал Ленин в период гражданской войны.
Putin also stated that that Ukraine was created by Lenin during the civil war.
И что если Украина хочет декоммунизации, то Россия сможет показать, что такое декоммунизация, имея в виду то, что он готов уничтожить вот это ленинское наследие в лице Украины, по словам Путина.
So Putin stated that if Ukraine wants decommunization, Ukraine may have it, meaning, of course, that Russia will be the one to do it with Ukraine, to eradicate all of the communist and Leninist legacy.
И что самое основное было на этой конференции, Путин заявил о готовности признать официально независимость Донецкой и Луганской народных республик, которые подконтрольны России.
And the main event is that Putin is ready to acknowledge the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic that are currently proxy regions of Russia.
Он также заявил лидеру Германии и Франции о том, что он готов признать и признает эти республики уже, возможно, даже сегодня.
He also stated to German and French leaders that he is ready to acknowledge these regions, maybe even today.
Признание этих республик со стороны России полностью подрывает Минские соглашения.
The acknowledgement of these republics undermines the Minsk agreements.
Также признаются эти республики в территории Донецкой и Луганской области в полном составе.
Also, these republics are to be acknowledged in the as a whole.
Что позволяет признать Украину оккупирующей страной со стороны России.
And that allows Russia to name Ukraine the occupant force of these territories.
И официально ввести российские войска на территорию Украины, то есть на территорию непризнанных республик.
And it also justifies the Russian military to invade these territories.
Это увеличивает вероятность возможной войны, которая может начаться с введения войск российских.
This escalates the possibility of real war, full-scale war.
И мы, революционные социалисты России и других стран, обязаны противостоять своему правительству, желать ему поражения и выступать против этой войны.
And we, as revolutionary socialists, must oppose our governments and oppose this war.
На этом у меня все. Спасибо за внимание.
That is all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you, Rosalia, for translating. A lot to digest there. Very valuable to have kind of more connected kind of contributions to what's actually happening. Our next speaker is Diana O'Dwyer from People Before Profit. Diana, if you'd like to take it away.
Hi everyone, it's great to see many people here. I'm really enjoying the discussion so far. What I have to add relates really just to the Irish role in all of this, the question of Irish neutrality and how this current crisis and the recent Russian military exercises in Ireland's exclusive economic zone are really being ruthlessly instrumentalised by the establishment here for two main reasons. On the one hand, to try to justify massively increasing Irish military spending, and on the other, which is completely bound up with the first, to push for a final abandonment of Ireland's long-standing policy of neutrality. Now, the report of the Commission on Defence Forces was published 2 weeks ago, and it was really a blatant attempt to soften up the public for a massive increase in military spending. And it sets out kind of three possible future trajectories for Irish military spending. And even the supposedly more reasonable level of ambition, number 2, suggested amounts to a 50% increase in annual military spending. Now, in monetary terms, that's about an extra 500 million euros per year. And this is supposed to be enough to enable the country to defend itself against attack, which I think is pretty incredible. And then there's level of ambition number 3, which is where this is all heading, which is to increase military spending by almost 2 billion euro. And in the report, it says this would match European norms for military spending and capabilities. And I think really that in itself gives the game away. Increasing military spending has nothing got to do with defending Ireland from the Russians or anyone else. What it's about is sucking up to the big boys in the EU and NATO by showing willing to supply a token number of foot soldiers to their military adventures, be it helping out the French in their former colonial territories in Africa or helping to legitimise US military interventions in the Middle East. That's what George Bush's coalition of the willing to invade Iraq was about back in 2003, and that's what increasing Irish military spending is about now. For a small country like Ireland, any increase in military spending, no matter how large, is going to be purely tokenistic when you compare it to the massive military budgets of the major military powers, and it's not going to protect us from attack. For us, the greatest defence is genuine neutrality and strong anti-war movements on the streets. Neutrality is a long-standing principle here, but the establishment in this country has been doing everything it can to undermine it for as long as I can remember, chipping away at it step by step. From ratifying the Lisbon Treaty, which the left pointed out at the time mandates progressively increasing military spending as part of being part of the EU, to participating in PESCO, to facilitating millions of US troops to use Shannon Airport as a virtual US military base en route to Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine. Also distinguishing between military and political neutrality and continually seeking to narrow the definitive neutrality out of all existence. But despite all of this, the principle of Irish neutrality still has massive public support. An exit poll during the 2019 local elections found that 82% of voters agreed that Ireland should remain a neutral country in all aspects. And that's an extremely progressive view that the vast majority of people on this island would share. And the sentiment behind it is to tie the hands of our elites, to stop them from committing us to imperialist wars, to prevent them from exploiting whatever the current propaganda for imperialist interventions is, be it weapons of mass destruction or humanitarianism or whatever, all the things that are used to try to justify sending soldiers overseas as cannon fodder for the great powers, as happened in every major war prior to Irish independence. Maintaining very small armed forces or abolishing them altogether, as Costa Rica has done, is compatible with that underlying sentiment, but the massive increase in military spending proposed in the Defence Forces report is not. So with all that extra military spending, you'd expect like that at least our woefully underpaid lower ranking army personnel would get a decent pay rise out of it, like if you're going to be spending between 500 million and 2 billion extra. But no, there's only a miserly 20 million of the 2 billion euro is for improvements to pay and conditions. And this is despite the fact that 85% of Irish military personnel earn less than the average industrial wage. Just like a growing number of workers at the moment, soldiers and their families struggle every day to keep a roof over their heads and to put food on the table. We need that 500 million, that 2 billion and more to even begin to put a dent in the housing crisis by building council housing again on a mass scale. It's outrageous that our establishment is fantasizing about buying squadrons of fighter jets. It's actually mentioned as one of the suggestions in the report and could cost around 1.8 billion euro at a time when you've nearly 2,500 children homeless and 1 million people on hospital waiting lists. So I really think the whole left must stand against this and not pretend that increased military spending and neutrality are in any way compatible or complementary for a small country like Ireland. We have to continue to refuse to take sides in imperial wars and in that way continue to stand against imperialism, regardless of whether it's coming from the Russia, the US, China, or anywhere else.
Thank you so much, Diana. Richard, would you like to? Richard is our next speaker. He is a TD for People Before Profit here in Ireland and a founding member of the Irish anti-war movement. Richard, you can work away.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks to all our contributors. And I have to say that was very illuminating, particularly to hear from our colleague in Russia. Look, I mean, the main thing I suppose I want to start by saying is that we are being fed, really over the last number of weeks, we are being fed with a absolutely relentless diet of one-sided propaganda about the character of the crisis that is unfolding in Ukraine. And the nature of that propaganda is to say that Putin and Russia are the aggressors here and that NATO are some sort of benign defensive force who are simply protecting the Ukrainians against Ukrainian aggression. And I think it is absolutely critically important that we challenge that completely one-sided presentation of the character of the situation that is unfolding. Obviously, I think it goes without saying, Putin is a despot and an autocrat who is an aggressor and has a pretty bloody history, whether it's Chechnya, or, you know, internally in terms of, you know, his very autocratic crushing of all sorts of progressive movements, his attack on the LGBT movement, you know, his ruthless suppression of attempts at democratic opposition, and so on and so forth. We have absolutely no time for Putin, and Putin's interest in the Ukraine is undoubtedly about maintaining the sphere of influence of Russian imperialism. That's what it's about. So he is a dangerous character, and we oppose absolutely any moves by Russia to engage in military aggression in Ukraine. But having said that, we have to absolutely drive a coach and horses through the idea that somehow NATO are good guys in this, or that they are any better in any shape or form, and we have to call them out for what they are. And I have to say, I do find it quite stunning already, the pathetic submission of the Irish media and of mainstream political discourse in refusing to question at any level the pro-NATO propaganda. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary when you think about what happened in Iraq. That, you know, we got this incredible pack of lies told by the United States, told by Britain, told by France about weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist to justify an utterly disastrous war in Iraq that claimed up to 1 million lives, that totally destabilized the whole region, which ultimately had the knock-on effect of destabilizing Syria and really causing absolute extraordinary mess and suffering across that region. And yet there is no questioning of NATO's credentials in the media when you think it's headed up by these nuclear powered states, by the United States most obviously, that were guilty of telling that pack of lies and justifying that absolutely murderous war. No questioning at all of their credentials. And we really have to call them out. Or you know, I just find it absolutely shocking. We have comrades in the anti-war movement at the moment who are organizing for protests and meetings over the war in Yemen at the moment. And you just think, you know, the very same United States that presenting itself as if it is somehow a defender, you know, that it's trying to prevent war or defend anybody's rights, is at the same time arming the Saudi dictatorship to the teeth. It's significantly increased its arms sales over the last 5 years across the globe, by the way. And the United States accounts for 57% of all arms sales across the world. They have significantly increased over the last 5 years, and the biggest growth in arms sales has been to the Middle East, and in particular to Saudi Arabia, to arm up the Saudi regime to commit absolute slaughter in Yemen, where tens of thousands of children and human beings are being slaughtered by the Saudis, but only because they are armed to the teeth by the United States, by Britain, by France, and so on. And yet, you know, the Irish media, the Irish political establishment say not a word of criticism or even questioning as to what their motives might be in this whole situation. And obviously, as others have said, the relentless eastward expansion of NATO, which inevitably is going to provoke the possibility of conflict with Russia. So I think it is critically important because it is a terrifying situation. There's one part of you thinks, surely they couldn't be mad enough to start a full-scale conflict. And I think there's a lot of us, you know, you're tempted by that thought. Surely they couldn't be crazy enough to do this. But it makes me think about the socialist Edward Bernstein, who a few years before the First World War was arguing from a supposedly socialist point of view that as global sort of economic interdependence and global trade grew, that you would never get wars again in the modern world because it didn't make sense. And he made these comments 2 or 3 years before the outbreak of the First World War, which was, you know, to become the greatest slaughter on human history that had taken place up until that point. So you might think these major imperial powers, in the 21st century, that as nasty as they are and so on, they couldn't be crazy enough to start a war with the potentially disastrous consequences that can have when you're talking about powers that are so heavily armed, that have nuclear weapons, and so on, and with the disastrous history of war of the 20th century, of the First World War, the Second World War, Vietnam, Iraq. Could they seriously be that crazy? But I think they are, because the system is crazy, and what's driving them is that sort of global competition, of economic competition spinning on into military competition between big powers, and they are more than capable of starting disastrous wars. Now, that's not to say there aren't complexities, as I think our speakers have alluded to, in the whole situation. The Ukrainians do have the right to self-determination, but we also know that that area is a sort of crossroads of competing imperial powers, and you have, Russian proxies operating for the Russians in some parts of Ukraine, and then you have, in some cases, quite far right-wing proxies operating for the interests of NATO, the European Union, and quite dangerous far-right politics. And the critically important thing is we do not side with any of these people, and that we actually argue against war and for internationalism, and against the folly of buying into either side in this, extremely dangerous competition and conflict between major imperial powers. And then, as Diane has done, let's particularly call out how the Irish government is using this crisis to further destroy the last remnants of neutrality. I mean, and they are the last remnants because, of course, the Irish political establishment have been trashing our neutrality for several decades now, and most egregiously in their facilitation of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at Shannon Airport, where millions and millions of US troops traveled through Irish airports en route to prosecute utterly disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and where that same airport in a supposedly neutral country was also used to facilitate the Gulfstream jets that were involved in the kidnapping and torture that is known euphemistically as the US rendition program, to kidnap people from around the world and bring them to Guantanamo Bay to torture them, or to send them to other sites in Egypt and other black sites around the world to torture people that they had kidnapped from various parts of the world. And the Irish government facilitated that. So absolutely, if people in this country rightly say we do not want to see Russian ships doing military exercises in the Ireland's exclusive economic zone, absolutely right. But that should also mean we do not tolerate British military exercises in Irish territorial waters, that we do not facilitate the US military machine at Shannon Airport to transport troops into Eastern Europe at the moment, as they begin to move troops into some of the neighboring countries in Ukraine, or that we continue to facilitate any of their murderous wars across the world, whether it's in the Middle East or anywhere else. So I think it is absolutely critical we do that, and we are at a very sort of dangerous moment from that point of view, because, I mean, Mike, we were talking off camera to Mike earlier on, and he was just saying how there's a lot of skepticism about the war, concern about the war, but people are a bit confused because Putin is a despot, he is an autocrat, and so there's a sort of understandable concern about that. But we cannot allow legitimate concerns about those things to blind people to the bloody history of Western imperialism and the imperialist agenda that NATO are operating in their engagement in this whole situation in Ukraine, the expansion of NATO, and indeed the close relationship of the European Union and the project by particularly powers like France and Germany to essentially establish Europe as a major military power and a player on the world imperialist stage, which things like the battle groups and the PESCO, structured military cooperation, the various foreign and defense policies that have been inserted into the European Union treaties, which Ireland signed up to, which are essentially about creating the legal framework for a European army, and which the Irish government hasn't got the confidence to directly say to the Irish people, we want to abandon neutrality, but by stealth and using crises like this are trying to slowly destroy the last remnants of neutrality and move us in actuality into that military political bloc of the European Union, in turn aligned with NATO. And they are undoubtedly using that crisis. And Simon Coveney, our Minister for Foreign Affairs, and you just hear all of the things that they're saying, they are simply recycling the US and NATO propaganda around the current situation. And we have to say, listen, what does neutrality mean? What does Irish neutrality mean? I mean, it doesn't have a legal definition, but the reason we have a tradition of neutrality is because this state was born in a struggle against empire, against imperialism. It had as a critical backdrop a revolt, not just against British imperialism, but when you think about people like James Connolly, he absolutely understood that not only was it the 1916 Rising and the revolt against Britain, a national battle, but that it was part of a battle against the imperial powers and the warmongering of all the major powers, and that it was vitally important that Ireland stood out against that because we have been victims of empires, and that we take an absolutely trenchant position of opposition to militarism and war by the major powers. And I believe the majority of people in this country hold that view in general, that they do oppose war, they do impose imperialism, but they are being hoodwinked with a lot of propaganda at the moment by both the media and the political establishment, and we have a responsibility and duty to call it out. And the very last point I would make is, I mean, I think at the moment, our numbers who are clear on this are relatively small, but that makes our duty to call this stuff out all the more important. And when the First World War broke out, the numbers of people who were actively organized to oppose the First World War were literally handfuls of people. They were people like James Connolly, they were people like Lenin and Trotsky and a handful of revolutionaries, people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, but they were a tiny, tiny minority. But they were clear in their principles of opposing war and imperialism. And as the bloody consequences of the First World War unfolded, and the lives of millions of working class people across Europe were sacrificed in that bloody war, millions did turn against that war. And indeed, it was that revolt of ordinary working people who came to understand that this was a war just for the profits of big corporations and the states linked to those corporations that eventually revolted and, made an attempt at least at trying to transform the world in a different direction. And I think that argument remains as relevant today when you think about the more than $1 trillion being spent on arms every single year. You think about what that could do to solve the housing crisis, the health crisis, all sorts of incredible levels of poverty and hardship and injustice and inequality across the world. If we could transform, redirect that wealth, that scientific know-how away from producing weapons that lead to wars into actually making the lives of ordinary people better, that is our responsibility and duty as socialists. And I think even if we're a small in number, we have to get that message across.
Thank you, Richard. Just first off, I wanted to say that John in the chat pointed out that not everybody might know what a TD is because not everybody is from Ireland in this Zoom. TD is basically a member of Parliament. Another thing I wanted to point out is that there is a protest on Thursday outside the Dáil, which is the Parliament in Ireland at 5:30 p.m. and it's going to be hosted by the Irish Movement. So if anybody is free on a Thursday, at 5:30 p.m., please pop down. I will be opening the floor for any questions from the chat. So just raise your hand, and I will raise your hand, and you can ask the question yourself. And then if we have time at the end, I'm going to come in with some questions from the chat. So if anybody would like to raise their hand, let me see. Owen, would you like to come in?
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks very, very much to all of the speakers. I think really great to hear everybody and kind of an international panel as well. I suppose I was just thinking when I was listening to Ashley and Dennis there as well in particular. I came into politics really, into activism really around anti-war politics in 2015 or so. It was after the Paris attacks, and subsequently France went on to bomb Raqqa in response. And I remember at the time that they bombed a hospital and a theatre. And this was, of course, once again, this kind of idea that I suppose of the kind of West intervening in the name of democracy and so on, which of course is utter nonsense. And at the same time, in the kind of same period, hearing a huge amount of apologism from the kind of, I suppose, from parts of the left, really, in relation to the butchery in Syria by Assad and by it was essentially kept in power by Russian support. Obviously, the Syrian revolution kind of crushed there. And I think, as Richard said, people probably think we say, and we're proud to say, we stand in the tradition of James Connolly. People like Connolly, as Richard said, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, Lenin, of course, in the States, Eugene Debs, all opposed the First World War, and they were in a minority at a time when people were calling for for workers and to row in behind their imperial power. And I think it's more important than ever, when the world is more dangerous than it has been in decades, that we continue to do that, particularly in a new kind of multipolar world where you have different imperial powers. I suppose I want to say, we need to build the fight here in Ireland for socialism. We're doing that. We're obviously fighting for housing, for healthcare, for workers and so on. But we also do, and this is crucial, we need internationalism. We need international solidarity from below. And that's a major part of what People for Profit are about, and why we have this meeting on tonight. So I urge people, join the protest on Thursday at 5:30. I think even more important, even as this meeting has gone on, I think the news has broken that Putin has recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. So I think we should be there on Thursday. And I would say, urge people as well, join People for Profit, help us build a movement that can fight both here for housing, for healthcare, for workers' rights here at home, but also build international solidarity and help to build a serious anti-war movement, which we're going to need over the next period. Thanks.
Thanks, Owen. Now, I'm just looking at participants. Sorry, I'm doing the Zoom on my phone. Kieran, would you like to come in?
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
You can indeed.
Yeah, there's just a couple of things. Just on the, it's interesting that when that whole fishing thing kicked off in the Atlantic, I think they were really annoyed that a couple of fishermen could go up to the Russian embassy, have a chat with them, and negotiate a settlement. And it was perfect kind of diplomacy, and it was very peaceful. And I was listening to bits on the radio, and they were saying, but they're lying to you, but they weren't. They managed to pull it off. But on the broader question here, there was an American socialist, John Reed, who reported on the Eastern Front during the First World War, and he was actually in Russia during the Revolution. He wrote a great book called many people know, 10 Days That Shook the World. But before that, he came back to America, and he was there around 1916, and there was a big push in America for America to enter the war, and he was asked at this big dinner for people who'd been over there, you know, what is the First World War about? And he was asked to give a speech, and his speech consisted of one word: profits. So that's that really sums up all these sort of imperial wars. And the other thing I'd say is, you know, when the Berlin Wall came down, and basically Russia, the Communist Party fell in Russia, the West was instrumental in Russia becoming a capitalist state. I mean, they basically went in there, and it was a shock therapy in Russia. The problem, I think, now I could be wrong on this, this is my own theory about it, was that Russia went capitalist, but it didn't go capitalist in hook with Washington or Brussels. It went its own form of capitalism with the oligarchs and so on. And that was a kind of a rivalry then to the West, which became an imperialist rivalry. And the thing like NATO was there, as far as I understand it, to apparently, I mean, I don't believe this anyway, but I mean, it was supposedly there. The whole idea was that it was going to protect the West against Russia and the Warsaw Pact. But when the Soviet Union fell and the Warsaw Pact fell, then the question is, why was NATO still there? So so its reason for being was to oppose the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact falls. So why is NATO? So therefore, there's no need for NATO anymore. It should just go. But obviously, NATO was there because its whole philosophy was an imperialist philosophy. It was nothing about. It was, I mean, the idea of it being defence was shown to what it was really about. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Kieran. Now, Pader, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I agree very, very much with the broad scope of the arguments. Just two points I want to make. One is in the imbalance, which I think Richard was particularly emphasizing in the media between Putin and the Biden side. It is obviously clear that a lack of criticism of NATO and US imperialism is obvious, but it's also obvious that we can't trust our own media. You know, they'll just go over the top on Putin, but they don't even do that particularly well. If we take two obvious examples, one is Kazakhstan. When Russia sent troops in, literally invaded Kazakhstan to put down a popular revolt in the support of their ally and dictator, there was muted criticism, if any, from the Irish media, from the Western media, and China's role in supporting them, that was received almost no attention either. Even though that alliance, China and Russia, under the pressure of American imperialism and its highly dominant position, are increasingly getting together to combat it. The second example, and it's going on as we speak, the other thing that became clear today, besides the declaration of the Republic, was the declaration by Belarus that the Russian troops won't be leaving anytime soon, that their occupation is indefinite. So it is, again, a tantamount to the invasion of Belarusia. And they have had a series of protests and repressions of democracy movements in Belarusia. There's almost no mention of this in the media. Again, the right of an imperial nation to invade a country at the behest of some nominal dictator is something that the Americans want to hang on to. So there's muted criticism of these things. Finally, I think the fisherman's example is a fine example. It shows you that not alone is the Irish government, when Coveney addresses the issue of military exercises by the Russians, just trying to encourage this notion of the Russians as dangerous, but he also doesn't even see the deferential, the wheedling deference that he treats the Russians with when he tells the Irish fishermen to get out of the way, whereas they have the good sense to say, what, you're going to come in here and start firing rounds where we fish? How dare you? You know, the proper attitude to an imperialist military exercise, which is get the fuck out of my field. So the fishermen show, and again, this is what we have to appeal to, the ordinary feelings about militarism, the ordinary feelings about firing. Like, I'll finish on this. That in a period where the world, Ireland has risen up against the notion of violence being carried out against women in particular, and everybody knows that in wars, violence is particularly meted out at civilians, at women, at children, and so on. This notion that we have an uncritical approach to the use of violence, military violence, or at least in this case, a one-sided one. And I'll finish with a question, which is, could the speakers just comment on the Chinese role, the pivot of the American forces from the Middle East and the disastrous pullout from Afghanistan, which wasn't really disastrous for the Americans, they're just rerouting their troops, and how this alliance between China and Russia means that there is, makes it all the more likely for there to be confrontations of this sort between the East and the West, between NATO and American forces, and between the Chinese and the Russians into the near future. And all the more reason for us to oppose our own government's support for militarism at home.
Thank you, Pater. Would any of the speakers like to answer that before we ask and we get more questions?
I can respond about China to Potter's question. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you raise an incredibly important point, because the media coverage and the attention has been mainly about the US/NATO and Russia, but behind that lies the big confrontation in the world system, which is between the US and China, the main economic powers in the world order. And what we're seeing, and Richard was addressing some of this, is the end of the period in which the US had unrivaled dominance over the world system. The US suffered massive defeat in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that, combined with the Great Recession, has led to its relative decline as a global world power, and it has opened space for the rise of rivals, regional rivals, and most importantly, China as a rising imperial challenger to US hegemony in the world. And that structures all geopolitical relationships right now. And that's at work in the US/NATO conflict with Russia over Ukraine. So if you saw in the Imperial Games, aka the Olympics that just happened, Putin and Xi Jinping had a summit in the midst of it, and they released a 5,000-word statement of increasing alliance between the two. And Xi Jinping, for the first time, came out against NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. And they also cut a deal for expansion of natural gas exports from Russia to China. So there's an increasing geopolitical and economic linkage being developed between Russia and China, which is in many ways what the US wanted to avoid most dramatically, because it's a nuclear armed petropower married to the second biggest economy in the world. That said, I think that China is actually reluctant to see this war explode. They're the #1 trading partner with Ukraine, and also they are worried about a precedent being set about violation of sovereignty, which they use really as a vehicle to justify their conquest of Hong Kong and of Taiwan. So they make a lot out of the question of sovereignty, and they also don't want to lose the trading relationship that they have with the United States, which is extremely important. So China, I think, plays an ambivalent role in this, but I think the law of unintended consequences is at work in a terrifying way. The recognition of these breakaway republics is, like we were saying in the chat, it's a precedent towards a trajectory of Russian intervention directly into those republics and assertion of their military power in those republics to defend them against Ukraine, which is being backed by the United States. And what's terrifying is this now involves China as well. And so you could see a schism at the heart of the world system. So I think it's a quite frightening development, and it underscores everything Richard said about the urgency of the small forces of the anti-war left building as best we can and sensing the emergency of this situation, opposition to this madness, to this mad scramble between great powers for dominance of the world system. And the only hope is solidarity from below, from Beijing to Washington to Kiev to Moscow, against the insanity that we're seeing develop in the world system.
Thank you, Ashley. Folks, just for the sake of time, I'm going to ask people to keep their questions 1 to 2 minutes, if that's okay. I think I'll get the speakers to come back in at the end to answer all questions now at the end of that. Okay, so next up is Kim. Kim, do you want to come in?
I can get my mic working. Hi, guys. Fair play to all. That was very interesting speeches at the start. So I guess my 2 parts of my question could be summed up as, what are the forces in the background? So the first one is a short one. The leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, is he a puppet of the US? What were the kind of circumstances surrounding his election? So if anyone could shed light on that, that would be excellent. And also the second one is a kind of interesting development, I suppose, in the political arena in America, where the mainstream left, it has had the specter of this Russian boogeyman, for the past few years, and they all seem to be pro-war. They seem to be, gunning for a fight. But the kind of 2 groups that have emerged, obviously, it's the far left, but also there has been a small splinter group on the right that have also opposed intervention in Ukraine. Now, is the thinking behind that Trump, with his America First rhetoric, that they see this as a kind of opposition to war, basically as a kind of popular position? Or is it they want to keep their powder dry for China? They see that as the main conflict that is coming down the road. Afghanistan withdrawal really, showed up the American military, that is, as I wouldn't exactly call it a paper tiger, but definitely not as strong as what they would have projected. And they're worried that a conflict in Russia, that, obviously a much stronger military power, that if that were to go, not their way, that it would show an inherent weakness that would embolden China. So is it just a case, not that they've become doves exactly, but that it's just kind of like a war affair? They're just waiting for a bigger conflict down the road with China. So, those are the 2 things, Zelensky and what is the thinking behind the fringe Republicans that are against intervention in Ukraine.
Thanks, Kim. Ed, would you like to come in?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank People Before Profit for this excellent webinar. I agree with virtually everything I heard. Just to let people know also that last Monday week, up to 1,000 armed US troops passed through Shannon Airport on Omni Air aircraft on their way from US air bases in North Carolina, and they were delivered to an airport called Rizhao, which is just 90 kilometers from the borders with Western Ukraine. We're not hearing about a buildup of US troops on the Western borders, where we are hearing about the buildup of Russian troops. It's a good idea, I think, to have demonstrations at the US and Russian embassies, but we would also like some support down at Shannon Airport, which is where our neutrality is being violated on a daily basis. But thank you very much, People Before Profit, for organising this.
Thank you, Ed. The other Ed Harper, would you like to come in?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, grand. Yeah, I mean, all these contributions are fantastic, and I think it's been a great meeting. And I'd just quickly like to say, clearly, our establishment politicians would sell their grannies if there was a decent price on grannies, and that's what it's all about. The only reason they're not is because you can't get much for a granny these days. But the fact of the matter is, our future, whether they fire a shot or not, is intimately tied up in this. We get about 12% of our grain from the Ukraine. And this is what it's about. This is why it's the Ukraine. This is why the Ukraine is what they're fighting over. It's a fantastic source of natural resources. It has the biggest provably recoverable uranium resources certainly in Europe, probably in the world. And the point about this is people may have noticed, if I can pull on one or two threads and try and get them together, that the EU have decided that nuclear power is green, the EU Commission. Okay, wouldn't it be nice to have in the European orbit a large source of uranium, because the kind of nuclear power that the EU are interested in is that which is adaptable to military weapons, that's to say uranium fission nuclear power and high temperature at that. And the other aspect of it is Canada's grain crop went to pieces last year because of the heat. We all know climate change is making the weather more severe. The food sources are less and less reliable. Wouldn't it be nice to have control one way or the other over Ukrainian grain? Because Ukrainian grain was traditionally one of the major sources of Russian grain. The Russians ate Ukrainian grain. And this is what it's about. And the terrifying thing about it is all these war games, all these moving large numbers of troops around here, there, and everywhere, and firing off weapons for practice and flying aircraft hither and thither. The effect that's having is now on the climate now. We're being told, we must not put the kettle on too full so as to save the climate and all this kind of nonsense. And what are they doing but playing games, expending carbon all over the place, totally, completely and utterly negating anything that we as ordinary civilian citizens can do in any of the countries. And they don't damn well care. And they don't care because what we're dealing with is, I'm sorry to say it, but people who are actually probably clinically insane. They are obsessed with the acquisition of something that doesn't exist. And if that isn't the definition of insanity, I don't know what it is. And that's called capitalism. And we have to overthrow capitalism, because until we do, we are never going to be able to solve the climate situation. And the climate situation is on a world scale far more important than them. I mean, which would you prefer, to be burnt to death in your bed by a Russian, American, Australian, you name it, shell, or be burnt to your death in your bed by a fire created by the climate? It doesn't matter. You burn either way. The only difference is all these stupid games they play. They seem to take the attitude they can put off till someday down the road to worry about climate change. They can't. It's happening now. And they're making it worse. And all this stupidity is making it worse. And our job as socialists is to stop allowing them to get away with keeping things in separate boxes. We have to make it very clear that we live in one world and one time. And there's no way that this will just hold it all off for a couple of years while we have a little war to fight over resources. Sorry, it's all happening now, and we've got to do something about it now. We cannot afford to allow this nonsense to carry on. And since the only place we can have a major effect ourselves as Irish socialists is Ireland, it really is time we really made a row about this. They're endangering all our lives now. And this nonsense about spending on defense has to be stopped. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed. Let's see. John, would you like to come in? And just to remind people, I'm really conscious of time. We don't want to be here till 10 p.m. So if we can kind of have everything said in about 1 to 2 minutes, that'll be great. John.
John Dean, me, is it? Bridget?
John Meehan. If that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief. I just want to stress to people what Ashley Smith said was very, very important. This crisis could easily end up much worse than it is already. And the idea of the law of unintended consequences is extremely important. We don't know at the moment how it's going to end, but if it does end in any kind of major war, it'll be especially a disaster, of course, for the people of Ukraine and Russia, but it'll have consequences right across Europe and across the world. Now, in that context, I think the tone of this particular meeting is very good because it's directing criticism both at the Russian regime and the United States. But I mean, I think the key thing is, I'll just finish on this, there was a good initiative on Kazakhstan. There's a lot of work put into it by Paul Murphy, TD, People Before Profit, around supporting the workers' uprising in Kazakhstan. And it got an awful lot of support across the radical left. And efforts are being made now to broaden that into other areas. And I think the same task arises for us over this Ukraine-Russia crisis. And part of that, I'll finish on this, there is a statement put out, it was by comrades in Britain. They just briefly make the point that for people living in Ukraine, the biggest actual threat at the moment is from the Russian army, that the Russian army may well invade. That's the key thing to focus on at the moment. We must listen to the people and the comrades in Ukraine about that very, very clearly. And their statement does have the beginnings of broad support against the war drive. This is absolutely essential. And lastly, in Ireland, it's important to keep that tone going, because I don't know about other people, but a good number of people I meet from various parts of Eastern Europe, they have direct experience of Putin, Russia, and so forth. And for them, listen to them, and they will tell you, if you aren't already convinced, of the danger of the Russian regime and Putin. And we have to get support from these kind of layers, because there are so many people here in Ireland from various parts of Eastern Europe, part of our workforce, and we have to make an audience with them. And it will not do if all we say to them is we give out to them about the Americans. We have to do both. It's absolutely essential. And thanks very much. It's a great meeting.
Thanks. Marnie.
Thank you. I just want to make a quick point, really. Ashley talked about the shifting rivalries at the moment in terms of America's role vis-a-vis China, new allegiances and alliances between Russia and China, which was done at the Olympic Games and so on. But I also want to point out that really at the moment, another background is the pandemic. The world has been through a pandemic, which historically upsets lots of ruling ideas. And what has come out very strongly from our speakers is that while powers have imperial and external plans, they are only too conscious of how they can control their own populations. And war is one of them. And Ashley has shown very well how Biden, in an expectation after Black Lives Matter, it suits him, war. Dennis has showed us that in Putin's Russia too, he's very nervous about his role. In Britain, it is absurdly the case. I mean, this buffoon at the top of the British government who is trying to use war in the most cynical way for his parties, I'll say no more, but also in France. Macron as well and in Ireland, in our way, that is why it is important for the points that Richard made. We cannot allow the government to get away with this whitewash idea about NATO, about PESCO being about cooperation. And so therefore, this Thursday is a beginning of building that kind of awareness that our government is doing it in order to stop us having anti-austerity movements, of looking for more wages. It diverts us. Well, let's be taken in. And we have a wonderful tradition here of knowing that you can build those movements. And as somebody said, they can often start small, but it's vitally important for our own development of not allowing them to get away with what they're trying to do at the moment in terms of living standards and housing and so on. This is part of that, because put them down there and we will also show that they have no credibility in the arguments they're making about war.
Thank you, Marnie. Folks, I'm going to kind of put a hard line on the questions because we'll be here all night. So after Glenda, no more questions. Kieran.
I think the message from this meeting is crystal clear that we're against both imperialist powers. But there's one thing I think that a socialist has to add, which is the main enemy is at home. James Connolly says he's against all ruling classes, my own top of the list. Karl Liebknecht said at home. Vladimir Lenin said, I hope that my country is defeated in the war because they are the main aggressor. So I think it's important to take that lesson as socialists and to understand that we start by attacking NATO's ambitions. We start by attacking the way RTE has become a mouthpiece for British and US intelligence. If you're listening to RTE, would you know, for example, that 28,000 US troops and NATO troops were sent to that region last year? That, for example, as Ed has pointed out, that US troops are being ferried from Shannon to Ukraine, that the IMF has been sent to Ukraine to wreak havoc economic as they've done in this country. These are the points we have to make. We have to start making the points. Now, when you make these points, you will be accused of being pro-Putin. Those of us who were against the Iraq war, we were accused of being pro Mr. Saddam Hussein. Putin is 100 times worse than Saddam Hussein, but we have to understand we have to be against our own ruling class in particular and its propaganda. The last point I want to make is the way you get an anti-war movement going is by, even though there can be difference of emphasis and different nuances and so on, the most important thing is to unite around very simple demands. Unite with everybody, all sorts of people, Sinn Féin, Vincent O'Toole, anybody that is willing to say no to war in Ukraine, defend Irish neutrality. And I hope the Irish anti-war movement will go from this meeting to building a broad front that will bring thousands eventually onto the streets to oppose this war.
Thank you, Kieran. John Dean. Are you there, John? Jack.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep it under 2 minutes. So just like a couple of quick things. Someone was asking about Zelensky. I mean, I don't know if everyone knows this already, but he used to be a TV actor who then kind of spurred in on a dark horse platform in order to become the president. He strikes me as somebody who might just be a little naive, like who puts a lot of credibility in the Western Bloc and US intelligence and whatnot. Possibly a US puppet in that indirect way. But anyway, just wanted to say there. Just on terms of the media thing, because just a few things to add in how we explain why the media does X. It's useful for us to appear, well, we know what we're talking about and to help distinguish our messages from the far right. Because, obviously sometimes they say, oh, mainstream media, this, blah, blah, blah. But obviously ours isn't based in the same conspiratorial worldview. First, you have, most writers don't actually write their own headlines. They're usually devised by the marketing department. When you read down most of these articles, you find, okay, it says, the article itself actually says, oh, US intelligence alleges this is happening, that's happening, this is necessary. And then you can talk about, the US and their history of the Gulf of Tonkin, of falsifying the information about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It's a good jumping off point there. Second is, the media kind of trusts itself. It's an Ouroboros in some sense. A lot of the time, RT doesn't have the resources to check what the New York Times and Washington Post reports on. A lot of the time, it treats themselves as the source. So if bad information gets in at the US end, it very easily spreads to everywhere else in the US sphere of influence. I could be wrong on that, open to being corrected. And second is that the US is, right, US reporters are very reliant on, government sources. They need an exclusive shot, they need an exclusive headline, they use someone who's in the government, and in order to keep that relationship going, they don't go too off message. Yeah, I'm over 2 minutes, I think, so I'll leave it at that. Although I just wanted to ask, are there alternatives to NATO and America in this situation? Like, are there any regional allies in the same situation as Ukraine, like Georgia? You know, Southern Ossetia was annexed from them. Are there groups or blocs that could form that can help Ukraine or offer some kind of support without necessarily dragging them into Ukraine and the Western Bloc influence? Okay, done.
Thank you, Jack. John Dean.
Thanks, Bridget, and thanks to all the speakers. Yeah, so the Irish neutrality is definitely like under attack every day in the media, news headlines that we see, like everybody said, and the establishment parties in Ireland, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, are only too happy to kind of add to this constantly and talk about neutrality like it's a bizarre or a crank, like you're a crank if you're standing for neutrality in the face of whatever it is this week or this month. But then also in the cultural content we consume, movies, TV shows, there's a huge industry in kind of just portraying war as a thing that, well, it's justified and it's important and so on and so forth. So it's that's what's happening. It's coming from the US, Britain, and now with the way the EU is moving towards PESCO, increasingly it's coming from Brussels as well. But so we have to be clear that it's not just we're for neutrality, which is it can be a tricky word, it confuses people, but we're against imperialist wars. We're against Russian aggression, we're against NATO aggression. And so we need to get out and join in protests, join in, as speaker said earlier, protesting about what's happening in Shannon, whenever there's any visiting people from like President of the US or anything like that, protest and say we're against the imperialist wars. And we can, even though we're the same as so many small countries under this barrage of pro-war propaganda all the time, we can push back and we can stand out and be important, like we were in the repeal campaign, marriage equality. Ireland stood out on the international stage by pushing back against this oppression, and we can do the same when it comes to war, and we can make it international that we're against imperialist wars. So I'd encourage everybody to get out at all protests that are defending Irish neutrality and against this war. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Dave O'Farrell, 2 minutes.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to say something quickly about the internal politics in Ukraine. I mean, the internal politics in Ukraine is incredibly fractured. I mean, people have mentioned Zelensky, who's the current president, former comedian and TV actor coming to power. But I mean, that's kind of just the tip of it. If you look at the election that brought him to power, I think 3 of the parties that ended up forming a government after the Maidan Revolution failed to even get enough votes to even enter parliament. It's incredibly fractured. And I think we need to remember that a large part of this is down to economic circumstances. Of all the states to come out of the USSR and the former Warsaw Pact, Ukraine has probably fared the worst economically of all of them. And a large part of this is down to the bloody IMF. Ukraine has been a member of the IMF since 1992. In that time, they've had 11 IMF restructuring programs. We know what IMF restructuring programs do, and we know in Ireland from bitter experience. So you can only imagine what 11 of them is going to do to a country. It's no surprise that their GDP is still only about 80% of what it was prior to the fall of the USSR. And that's prior to this crisis. It's probably much worse now. I mean, part of the program demands before the Maidan revolutions called for a 40% rise in the price of gas for domestic customers. Really, really vicious stuff. So if NATO or the military arm of US and Western expansion and aggression, the IMF for the economic shock.
Thank you, Dave. Ben, and then we'll have Glenda, and then we're done for questions. Ben.
All right. Thank you. I just want to bring up a quick point on one of the causes that I think as socialists we need to use this as an opportunity to call out the global military industrial complex. Because one of the main reasons Russia took this very sudden turn against Ukraine, who previously, like if you look into interviews with people in Crimea and in parts of eastern Ukraine, they, in the early stages of the war, at least, they said like, oh, we feel betrayed by our brothers in Russia. The reason Russia took this turn was because they'd lost valuable military ports and they were seeking to reopen shipbuilding in Ukraine, which would have allowed them to massively expand their navy, nearly double it, in which is one of Putin's main plans. So I think it's just something that needs to be noted, that the global military industrial complex is now fueling these wars of to, you know, expand military production in people's countries. And it's just something that needs to be noted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Glenda, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just want to say I put a couple of links about changes in the attitude toward nuclear war. There used to be something called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction, after the war, in which various countries agreed that you couldn't start a nuclear war and win it. The US is now putting out the idea that nuclear war can be won and how they go about it, and tactical nuclear weapons. And I don't imagine that the Chinese are not doing the same thing. And it seems to me that we have to be aware that, first of all, there used to be war where soldiers fought soldiers and there were casualties among humans who were not involved. But now civilians and children are in the front line, and starvation is being used as a callous weapon of war. I mean, even Biden, like taking away money that belongs to Afghanistan to give to the 9/11 survivors. That is absolute insanity. But the thing is, as long as they think nuclear war can be won, there's going to be a move toward more and more nuclear weapons all over the world and various kinds that they think they can get away with. And just to sum up, I think we have to be aware of this, that we all know that whenever weapons go into a country, they end up in who knows whose hands. They ended up with the Taliban, they ended up with ISIS, they'll end up with neo-Nazis in Ukraine. There's no way that they really can be controlled. So sending weapons to any country is the worst thing that can possibly be done. And we really have to stand up against that.
Thank you, Glenda. Now, would any of the speakers like to come in on any questions?
I could just come in on the question about Trump and Biden and the shift between one to the other and foreign policy. So I think that's very important, and it addresses the question about the far right in the United States too, in opposition to this war. The first thing to understand, I think, is that we're building an anti-war movement in a changed world is different than the situation we found in the anti-war movement against the US occupation, invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera. That was in a situation where the US was pretty much an unrivaled global power. Now we're building an anti-war movement in which there's a fact of rivalry that's undeniable, that fills the daily news and is part of the calculations of the states of the world and the boardrooms of the world. So that is very different. The key antagonism is the US and China, but also Russia and many other antagonisms that are proliferating both regionally and globally throughout the world. Now, in that situation, the US has had to change its strategy, because its strategy was really to be the global policeman of a kind of cooperative relationship between the world states of global capitalism. With the rise of the rivals, they need a new strategy. And there was attempts under Obama to develop a new one. The pivot to Asia was an example of that, of beginning to confront China. But for all sorts of reasons, Obama failed to really enact an overall grand strategy. Trump came in with an America First strategy. Screw the alliance system that we built up during the Cold War. We're going to have unilateral and one-off relationships with all sorts of powers throughout the world, and bargain for the interests of the US to the exclusion of the alliance structure, which was a huge disruption for the establishment of its heretofore dominant strategy. And it really didn't work. It didn't restore American dominance, and it blew up and discredited the US around the world. Biden came in and said, okay, what we're going to do is we'll rebuild the country, we'll build up the military, we will band together the allies that the US has built up over decades into a new, what he called League of Democracies. He even had this summit that included all sorts of undemocratic states to band those states together. And the antagonist was explicitly China, most importantly, but also Russia and Iran and North Korea, et cetera, the kind of axis of autocracies that the Washington think tanks like to talk about. So that is the predominant strategy, and Biden is pursuing that in the middle of this conflict. That's what's going on. If you look at how he's using NATO and all the historic relationships that they've built up. Now, the far right, for all sorts of reasons, is in opposition. But we have to say the Republican Party is lockstep with Biden on this. And in fact, they're more aggressive than Biden in ramping up the pressure on Russia. So they actually wanted to pass the sanctions even before Russia had done anything to invade Ukraine. So they're actually more aggressive. It's only a small section of the Republican Party that's anti-war and in support of Putin. People like Tucker Carlson on Fox News. And there's several reasons for that. It has to do with the Trumpite America First policy. It has to do with their love affair with strongmen in the world system. It has to do with the fact that Putin has funded the far right globally and struck up alliances with all sorts of far right organizations throughout the world. So I think that explains the current, but it's pretty isolated. I think there's more kind of an isolationist impulse. We got to take care of things at home is the dominant kind of skepticism about the war, but that's not good enough. We have to, as the left, I think, deepen a much more thorough anti-imperialist perspective like this webinar has done, and also start mobilizing people in opposition to this war in Ukraine and tap into the deep well springs of anger and frustration about that. Hundreds of thousands of people have died in this pandemic. There is massive pressure on people economically due to inflation. There is ramping up in a backlash against Black Lives Matter of law and order policing, and all the money is going to militarism. Biden couldn't get anything passed in the interests of regular people. So there are deep well springs of opposition to what's going on, and we on the left have to organize and mobilize that sentiment. And luckily, we've got a surprising level of industrial militancy that's starting to develop that's likely to escalate in the next year. And the task of the left is to bring these politics into that living class struggle, so we can build a kind of internationalist working class movement and left in our world. And I just think the final thing I'll say is about what the alternative is, which one comrade raised that question. And there's no state that really represents an alternative to this military madness that we see playing out in Ukraine. Really, the alternative is working class and people building solidarity across borders and common struggle against their own exploiters and against their own state, but in solidarity with similar movements. And that has been developing for the last decade. Since the Great Recession, we have seen the largest explosion of mass struggles and even revolutions that we've seen in quite a long time. What's been missing in the middle of those is coherent left-wing organizations, socialist forces, and with people with the politics to galvanize that in a kind of emancipatory struggle to turn, the catastrophes in our world system into a socialist direction and a fight for a better society. So we really have to redouble and build our efforts to do that in the middle of building an emergency anti-war movement.
Thank you, Ashley. Diana seems to have left, and so has Dennis. So I'll give Richard, work away.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I just want to thank everybody for the meeting. I think really the points have come across, and Ashley summed it up as well as it can be summed up there. But the only thing I just add is we need to remind people that the drive to war is not some sort of aberration in the system we live under, but it is the norm. It is the norm for capitalism. And that if you look at the history of capitalism, what you see is a history of war, disastrous wars. And sometimes I think people, you know, when there's a period of relative stability in the Western world, people sort of get lulled into the idea that that's going to become a thing of the past. And I think we have to just remind people that if you just take the most cursory look at the history of the past 200 years, since we established an economic system that is based on, as its basic principle, relentless and ruthless economic competition, which then builds up to military and political competition, that is the nature of our system. And when the tectonic plates, the sort of political plates of who are the dominant powers, where powers are weakening slightly, or where certain powers are beginning to challenge other powers for control of part of that system, for resource-rich areas, for areas of strategic, economic, or political importance, that leads to war. And when the system is failing people, when they can't deliver for ordinary people, then, if you like, the drive towards war often begins to build up. And that's also partly the explanation for people like Zelensky, because you do have, you know, to quote the famous lines from the W.B. Yeats poem written at the time of the First World War, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the earth. And there is a recurring feature of when the system gets into trouble, when it's sort of more like conventional political pillars are unable to deliver for the mass of people, and the system is in trouble, then you also get sort of certain somewhat bizarre political manifestations. I mean, Ukraine elects a comedian to become president. Grillo emerges in Italy to as a comedian who also becomes a major political player, sort of populist, anti-establishment politics. But of course, they're not really clear politics of challenging the system that has produced that crisis and that instability. They have no alternative, and often very quickly find themselves accommodating to the system, or are being quite dangerous and right-wing in their politics. But it's all the sign of a system that is failing, and a system that has this very, very dangerous, irrational logic at the heart of it, which is about ruthless and relentless economic turning to political and military competition. And that we have to break from that system, and that system is failing people on the most elementary levels of things that really do matter to them. And that's why Dave's point about the IMF is a very, very important point about the imposition of austerity there. And remember, it was a similar pattern in the Balkans War, which, you know, has similar characteristics, where you had an economic and austerity program imposed by the IMF prior to the Balkans War. It had a disastrous economic impact. It caused huge dislocation. And in the absence of a strong left that can channel people's anger in a positive direction of working class people fighting for the things that matter to them, then dangerous forms of right-wing politics, of nationalism, and so on, and often manipulated by the big imperial powers, can come to the fore. So we have to challenge the logic of that system, and we have to uphold the banner of internationalism and of working class solidarity, and remind people, you know, that this logic of war will only be a disaster for the majority of people, and that our interests are in uniting on an international basis to fight for the things that actually make life better for working class people, for housing, for healthcare, for education, and that war is a very, very dangerous diversion away from the struggle for the things that really matter for working class people.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Dave, not Dave, sorry, Dennis. And also thank you, Diana. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to all our contributors. I think it's about time to wrap it up now. It's getting quite late. Just a reminder, the protest in Ireland, in Dublin, is going to be outside the Dáil at 5:30 p.m. on Thursday, and it's held by the Irish anti-war movement. So please get down there if you can. And I think that's everything. Enjoy the rest of your evening, folks. Eat your dinner, get some sleep. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bridget.
Have a good day. See you later, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you all.